Okay guys, here comes Timmy at you again, and today what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you a little bit about the anatomy of the eye and the ear. So first of all, a couple of things. The reason we have two eyes separated by a distance is to allow for binocular vision. All right, now watch. Now do this, especially when I'm not on the road. Try driving home with one of your eyes shut and see how you can make that turn. The purpose of having two eyes separated by a distance allows us to perceive depth. And any animal who has its eyes in the front of the head are predators. So that allows them to estimate a distance because of that binocular vision and determine whether or not they can run after it, that antelope, and get it. Prey, on the other hand, have eyes on the side of their head, and that allows them to see bad stuff almost 360 degrees. So human beings are, like it or not, predators. All right, so let's go over some of the basic anatomy. First of all, the eye itself. You have eyelids, right? And you have these eyelashes. And then when we talked about the skin, there are tons of sebaceous glands in the eyelashes. As a matter of fact, there's the most sebaceous glands anywhere in the body are located in the eyelashes, and the purpose of that is to keep those eyelashes smooth so it can deflect any potential debris, and it also gets sweat out of your eyes too. That's the purpose of having eyebrows. And if you look at the way the eyebrows are arranged, they're arranged medial to lateral, so when sweat drips off your forehead, it will drip to the side of your eyes, not in your eyes. Now, what most people think is that this is where your tear gland is. It couldn't be farther from the truth. Now, think about it, right? You got a window. You're not going to start washing the window here, right? You start at the top. So the lacrimal gland is actually underneath the upper eyelid. And these two things here are little drains, little caniculi channel. These allow the tears to drain from that are produced by the lacrimal gland into the nasolacrimal sac. Basically, that's a little collecting area for extra tears so that your nose ain't dripping all the time. And then those excess tears go through the nasolacrimal duct and then out your nostril. That's why a little kid who wants G.I. Joe with the Kung Fu grip for Christmas and he doesn't get it, he gets a textbook instead, right? And that he'll never read. That's just a little tick mark. Every time I talk about non-textbook reading, put that there. Anyways, so watch. You got the cornea. I'll talk more about that later. That has to be continually moistened. So the lacrimal gland will produce tears, and when you blink your eye, it spreads that tear over the entire surface of the cornea to keep it moist. Now, dry air, cold air is dry air, warm air, moist air. So that's why when you go out in the cold, the air is very dry. So the lacrimal glands will produce tears. They will drain into the nasolacrimal duct and out your nose. That's why your nose runs when it's cold out. All right? So let's look at now just some of the features of the eye. First of all, the white part of the eye is the sclera. And basically the sclera, the purpose of the sclera, the white of your eyes, is to protect it. It's very thick, dense, connective tissue. And it's basically designed to kind of hold the shape of your eye, and because it's thick tissue, it also secures the extraocular muscles, the muscles that allow your eye to move in different directions. Then you have the color part of the eye, and that's the iris. Now, the iris is interesting, and I'll show you, just so you know I'm watching you. The iris is actually made up of two bands of muscle. You have the circular band of muscle, and then you have these radial bands of muscle. And these radial bands of muscle and circular bands of muscle will contract or relax, and that will determine the size of the pupil opening. Now, when we talked about the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? That when you're scared, think about it. You're usually scared in some dark alley, right, or whatever. And you need to get as much light into your eye as possible. So what you want to happen is you want that pupil to get bigger. Now, when that happens, the radial bands of muscle relax. The circular bands of muscle relax, and then the radial bands will contract, and that will open up the pupil. Now, pupil size is important, especially in people who have suffered a drug overdose and you don't know a history on them. If they come into the emergency room and they're unconscious, one of the first things the doctor will do, besides trying to get a copay out of the guy, is to look at the pupil size. So they'll open their eyes and they'll look initially at the size of the pupil, and then they'll flash a light there. And by flashing a light, the pupil will get smaller. So what the physician wants to know is, do those pupils react like they should? Do they get smaller when light is flashed, and do they get larger when no light is flashed? So that's really important, because that determines to a large degree if there's anything wrong with the brain. Maybe it's got a closed head injury. Drug overdose, now look, drugs that mimic the sympathetic nervous system, that hype you up, methamphetamine, cocaine, things like that, that's going to mimic the sympathetic nervous system. So these people's pupils, when the doctor opens them up, are going to be really wide. The opposite is true. If someone's on heroin or barbiturates, right, they put you to sleep. So the pupil is going to get really, really small. So the iris, again, radial bands of muscle and then circular bands of muscle, and they will contract or relax to allow the pupil, the opening that allows light into the eye, to get bigger or smaller. Now, to a large degree also, the color of your eyes is determined obviously by genetics, but it's also determined by the amount of melanin present. So darker skinned people tend to have darker eyes, and lighter skinned people have lighter eyes. So the lighter your skin color, typically, the lighter your eyes will be. Now, and that's not 100%, and we all know that, but generally speaking, that's the case. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a cross-section of the eye. So here's a cross-section of the eye, and the eye is divided into two main chambers. You have the anterior chamber, and the anterior chamber of the eye is from the iris, this part right here, to in back of the cornea. So if I were to color in the anterior chamber, trying to stay in the lines there, I grade myself on that. Not bad. That's the anterior chamber of the eye, and it's filled with a clear fluid that's basically water and nutrients, and that clear fluid is called aqueous humor. So aqueous humor is circulated, and its function is to nourish the cornea. There are no blood vessels in the cornea, but the cornea is living tissue. So you have to feed it and get rid of the metabolic waste, and aqueous humor does that. Now, in back of the iris, and including up to the retina, you have the posterior chamber. Now, the posterior chamber of the eye is filled, boy, that's terrible, is filled with a gel-like substance called vitreous humor. And the reason it's called vitreous humor is because it contains a protein called vitrecin. And these little protein strands are what make it a little gel-like. So if you think of Jell-O that hasn't hardened completely, that's about the constituent of vitreous humor. Now, some of the things that can happen as people age, the amount of vitreous humor decreases. So this vitrecin, this protein strand, they can start collecting together, and they start forming like a little solid. The result is that vitreous humor is no longer clear, and that can result in these things called floaters. Now, people with diabetes tend to get floaters because of the problems with protein metabolism. And just as you age, that'll happen. The function of vitreous humor is basically to maintain the shape of the eyeball. And it also helps nourish the lens. More on that later. So those are the two big chambers of the eye. The anterior chamber, everything in front of the iris and behind the cornea, and that is filled with aqueous humor. And then behind the iris and in front of the retina, so the back of the eye, is filled with vitreous humor. Now, suspended directly in back of the iris is the lens. And the lens is made up of concentric rings of protein. I'll show you a little better picture in just a second. And that lens, the lens you're born with, is the lens you end up dying with. And as you know, that lens is made of protein, and how the amino acids are put together make it translucent, make it clear, and that's exactly what you want, right? And the function of that lens, just like the lens of a camera, is to focus on objects that are near or far, so you can develop sharp vision. So if you look here, you can see these concentric rings of protein that make up the lens. And then, as you can also see, there's these little ligaments that suspend the lens directly in back of the pupil. Now, this is important. You know, when you have a telephoto lens on a camera, that lens will move in and out in order to focus on an object either far away or near. Well, your eyes don't do that, obviously. In cartoons, maybe. So what happens if you have to focus on objects that are near or far or wherever you are? All right. What will happen is these little suspensory ligaments are actually connected to muscle. That muscle is called ciliary muscle. And ciliary muscle, just like all muscles, they contract or relax. So when the ciliary muscles contract or relax, what it will do is it will pull on those ligaments and it will change the shape of the lens. And that allows us to focus on objects that are close or far away. You can do it immediately. And the reason you do that is because these muscles will contract or relax, changing the shape of the lens to allow you to change your focal point. Now, as you age, that protein becomes denatured, right? Just like when you take an egg, the white part of the egg is albumin, which is a protein. But before you dump it into the frying pan, it's clear. But then when you add heat, you change the shape of it and it turns white. So as people age, the lens becomes denatured, the protein in it, and it becomes cloudy. And you develop a cataract, right? So you got to have cataract surgery and get that removed. But you don't want that. You want to go to Gateway. So here's the other thing too, and I'll show you this. In addition to the muscles, there's some specialized cells within the ciliary muscle called ciliary bodies. And ciliary bodies produce aqueous humor. So aqueous humor is produced by these ciliary bodies. And again, the function of aqueous humor is to produce ciliary bodies, and it'll flow around the lens and through the pupil, and then its job is to nourish the cornea, which is clear. And then in the corner of the cornea, nice, there are these little canals called canals of Schlemm. And what they do is they remove the excess aqueous humor and the metabolic debris from the cornea, and then the canals of Schlemm are connected to the venous system, and it's drained back to the right side of the heart. Now, in some people, these canals of Schlemm, especially diabetics, they can get blocked with some protein debris. And what will happen is the ciliary bodies will continue to produce the aqueous humor, but it won't be able to be adequately drained. And the result is that the amount of aqueous humor increases, so your intraocular pressure goes up, IOP. And if your intraocular pressure goes up, and they measure that with the little puff of air if you go to the ophthalmologist to get your eyes tested, then if that continues to go up, you get a condition called glaucoma. So how do you treat that? Well, what you do is you reduce the production of aqueous humor, and there's a couple of ways. There's a beta blocker out there called timolol, and they put a couple eye drops in their eyes, or you can do what most people choose to do, and that is smoke THC, tetrahydrocannabinoid. So they can smoke pot, and smoking pot decreases the production of aqueous humor. That's why pot is prescribed for people with glaucoma. Now, some people smoke pot as a prevention for the development of glaucoma. At least that's what they say. And who am I to judge, right? Okay, so let's go back real quick. So remember, the cornea is translucent. It's clear protein, but it has to be nourished. And again, what nourishes the cornea and remove the metabolic waste? It's the ciliary bodies that produce the aqueous humor. It will nourish the cornea. And then in the corner of the cornea, that aqueous humor is drained into the canals of Schlemm. Now, the function of the cornea is to refract, that means bend light, to focus it on the lens. ultimately. Now, most cornea are round, but some people are born with a cornea that is more football shaped. And in some cases, if you look, the ophthalmologist looks real hard, you can actually see the laces on that football shaped cornea, and it says NFL. But I digress. No, it is football shaped. So what they do is they do what's called LASIK, or laser assisted incisional radial keratotomy. Basically what they do is they put radial slits in the cornea to allow it to change its shape. So people with this football shaped cornea have what's called a astigmatism. That's astigmatism. All right. Now, watch. And again, you've experienced my poor drawing, but here's a person who apparently is in trouble, got a neck much too long. Now, when you're looking at somebody, how optics works is when light comes in, the lens will focus it on the retina. But when it focuses it on the retina, the object is actually upside down. And it is the occipital lobe, the part of your brain and back, that will actually turn that image right side up. So our focal point is too small to have that image upright. So that's why the images that are focused on the retina are actually upside down, and it's the occipital lobe of your brain that actually turns it right side up. All right, so function of the cornea. Again, it's clear translucent protein, and its function is to bend light and focus it on the lens. The lens is to focus that image on the retina. And remember that the lens changes shape by these ciliary muscles that are connected to these little ligaments, and it will either contract or relax to change the shape of the lens. All right, the iris, the colored part, it's made of circular and radial bands of muscle. All right, now what I want to do is I want to talk to you about the retina. So the retina is really where the rubber meets the road, right? So the retina's job is to collect the light, the photons of light. A photon is an energy unit of light, right? And the retina's job is to take those photons of light and convert them into electrical impulses, right? And those electrical impulses are then sent via the optic nerve to the occipital lobe, where they're interpreted as images. Now, a couple of things about the retina. Number one, the retina is the only part of the body where you can actually see blood flowing through an artery. So it is not uncommon, especially people with diabetes who develop these plaques in small arteries. They should have a dilated eye exam every year. And what doctors are looking for is actual plaque buildup in these small arteries. Also, within the artery, within the retina, are specialized cells called rods and cones. So these specialized cells take the photons of light and then convert them into electrical impulses. Now, a couple of things. Number one, rods. Rods are used for dim light. And the problem with that is they only see in black and white. That's why if you're in a room and it starts to get darker and darker and darker, it's more difficult to distinguish color. And the reason that is because the only thing that can pick up dim light are the rods, and they see in black and white. Then you have the cones. The cones are for sharp vision. and they see in color. And you're not going to believe it, but there's an area of your retina called the macula. And the macula is directly in back of the lens. And the macula has the greatest concentration of rods and cones. And there are areas of the macula, so called the fovea or fovea centralis. So the macula, big area, fovea, a specific area within the macula, and the fovea centralis has the greatest concentration of rods and cones. That's why you see the sharpest vision and the most detail and color when you're looking directly at it, because the greatest concentration of cones is within that fovea. And that's why as you move out into your peripheral vision, less detail you can determine, and even colors become a little more difficult to determine. And that's because as you move away from the fovea to your peripheral vision, there are less cones and more rods. That's why eyewitness testimony in a trial isn't always the best, because if a person wasn't able to see the person clearly because they couldn't see them directly, that's usually invalid, and that's how lawyers break that apart. Now, just lateral to the macula is this area here called the optic disc. The optic disc is where the retinal artery, retinal vein, and optic nerve, they exit the back of the eye. Now, the reason I bring that up is this is called the optic disc. And the optic disc contains no rods or cones. So because there's no rods or cones, everyone should have this circular black part in their field of vision, but you don't. And the reason you don't is what the occipital lobe does is it takes what you're looking at and it actually fills in the missing pieces. I don't know, I think that's pretty amazing, right? So retina, specialized cells called rods and cones. Rods are used for dim light and they see in black and white. Cones for sharpness of vision and they see in color. So if you have damage to a particular cone, you may not be able to see a particular color, so that produces color blindness. Now, again, the greatest concentration of cones is in the macula, specifically the fovea or fovea centralis, and that's directly in back of the lens. And that's why looking at something directly, you get your greatest and sharpest vision. All right. Now, just a couple of other things. First of all, attached to the sclera are extraocular muscles. And these muscles are controlled by cranial nerves. And that's why damage to your brain can result in damage to cranial nerves and result in problems with moving your eyes. So there's lateral, medial, superior, and inferior. And this allows the eye to move up and down, and that's what allows you to kind of roll your eyes, especially when you're listening to this, rolling your eyes. Anyways, sometimes when people are born, one muscle is stronger than the other, and they get what's called the lazy eye. So what do you do if you have a lazy eye? Well, you make that lazy eye work. So the normal treatment for a lazy eye is to patch the good eye and make the lazy eye start working. If that doesn't work, what they'll actually do is they will inject Botox. Botox actually paralyzes muscle. And that Botox, by paralyzing the stronger one, can weaken it a little bit so you can straighten that eye out. Now, a couple of other things too. If you notice the sclera, we're one of the few animals that has a white sclera. Most mammals have a sclera that is the color of their iris. Now, this is evolutionary because what it does is it allows you to distinguish between the sclera and the iris, and you can, if you're close enough to somebody, you can tell whether or not they're looking at you. And that's important because back in the day, you wanted to make sure, okay, is this person friend or foe, right? So we've developed that, and you know, the old saying is don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes, right? This allows people to determine if somebody is looking at them and then is a potential threat. All right, so that'll do it for the eye. I hope that helped. Okay, guys, we're going to move on to the ear. What? I know, it's terrible. Okay, a couple of things, right? Watch. Why do we have two eyes again? That's to allow us to produce binocular vision and determine distance, right? Now, why do we have two ears? Why don't we just have one big one like a radar dish on top of our head? Well, the answer is the same reason, right? Watch. If you're sitting down and someone on your left-hand side says, I'm going to kill you. Well, look, you want to be able to determine what direction that sound came from. So if you're sitting there minding your own business, you don't know that somebody's on your left and they're saying, I'm going to kill you. The sound waves that produces will enter your left ear first. It will then resonate through your skull bones and enter your right ear just a split second later. And the temporal lobe, where sound waves are interpreted, is able to triangulate that and determine direction. Now, that's important because determining direction of sound can help you. The problem is when the sound is directly in front of you or behind you. So if there's a killer, you should say, Mr. Killer, will you take a step to the right or the left and repeat the fact that you're trying to kill me? I don't know if they would do that, but anyways. So that's the reason we have two ears and not just one big one. Now, the outer ear is referred to as the pinna or auricle, and its function is to funnel sound waves into the external auditory canal or external auditory meatus. Now, you've got this little part here, and this little dangly part here is called the tragus. Now, some people, their tragus is not connected, and those people may in fact have criminal tendencies. So look around. I'm just playing. All right, so watch. The external auditory canal is where the sound waves are funneled, and it has a lining that is skin. Now this is important. And it has modified sweat glands, and these modified sweat glands produce not sweat, but rather cerumen. Cerumen, or earwax, cerumen, or earwax is protective, and this wax prevents stuff from getting into the ear and damaging it, and it also kind of lubricates the skin within the ear. Now, watch. Also, the skin of the external auditory canal, that actually sloughs off, and it sloughs off from the inner part of the canal to the outer part. So your ears, to a large degree, are actually self-cleaning. That's why doctors tell you not to put a Q-tip in there, because if you put a Q-tip in there, what you end up doing is smashing down the earwax, the cerumen, and then that self-cleaning no longer can occur. So don't do that. Don't clean your ears. Read the textbook. Now, the external auditory canal and the pinna make up the external ear. And then you have, separating the external auditory canal is a thin translucent membrane. I'll show you a better picture in a minute. This is called the tympanic membrane, or eardrum. And the eardrum separates the external auditory canal from the middle ear. And the middle ear is normally air-filled. Now, I'll show you a little better picture. Hang on. So here is the eardrum, and then there's tubes in the ears. So any gook that was in the middle ear, so young kids who get frequent ear infections, they will have tubes placed. And instead of that gook, that pus and infection building up in the middle ear, it's allowed to drain out of these tubes. And when it drains and the infection is cleared up, the immune system will look and say, hey, I'm not supposed to have this plastic tube in my eardrum, and it'll push it out. A lot of times the parents will find the tube on the kid's pillow or in the bed someplace, right? So the function of the tympanic membrane is simply to amplify sound waves, right? So that's its function. Now, watch. Connected to the tympanic membrane are the three auditory ossicles. They're bones, smallest bones in the body, and they form joints. And the three bones are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Or you probably learned that in ninth grade biology, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. So how you remember the order is M-I-S, malleus, incus, stapes. And again, their function, along with the tympanic membrane, is to amplify sound waves. So if you damage your auditory ossicles or your tympanic membrane, then you have what's called conduction hearing loss. And a hearing aid will help you. And that's what happens to most people. And as people age, just like any other bones in the body, they don't move as freely. And as a result, that's why older people tend to lose their hearing, and they tend to lose it in the higher frequencies. And I'll explain more about that in a little bit. So the middle ear consists of the three auditory ossicles, and it's normally air-filled. Now, connecting the middle ear to the back of your throat is called the auditory tube, or eustachian tube. And it's surrounded by muscle. And normally, that muscle is contracted and the eustachian tube is closed off. Now, the function of this auditory tube or eustachian tube is to equalize the pressure from the middle ear and the external ear. Now, normally, pressures don't change much, right? You're not mountain climbing all the time, and you're not on a plane all the time, or deep sea diving. So when you go up in a plane and they pressurize the cabin, you have to change the pressure within your middle ear, or it can damage your eardrum. So what will happen is the muscle will relax, and that popping sound that you hear is actually the auditory tube opening up and allowing the change in atmospheric pressure. And chewing gum can help relax that muscle. That's why they tell you to chew gum. All right? Then, this is important. The stapes, the smallest bone of the auditory ossicle, is connected to the inner ear. And the inner ear is made up of two big parts, and I'll show you a little better picture in a minute. It is made up of the semicircular canals, and these semicircular canals are fluid filled, and these semicircular canals are involved in maintaining balance and equilibrium. So that's why if you have an inner ear infection, you can develop vertigo where it feels like the room is spinning. Then the second portion, and the one I'm going to be talking about a lot, is the cochlea. Not Coachella. That's a music thing in like California or something. So this is the cochlea. So the cochlea takes the sound waves that were amplified by the tympanic membrane and the auditory ossicles, and it converts them into electrical impulses. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. So let's take a little closer view of that. Now, watch. If you look here, there's pitches to sounds, right? So a high-pitched sound has a high frequency. A low-pitched sound has a low frequency. Watch, the bumps occur less frequently. That's low pitch. High pitch, the bumps occur more frequently. Now, what's the function of the tympanic membrane and the auditory ossicles? Well, their job is to amplify the sound. So when I say study, that sound wave comes in and it will begin to vibrate the tympanic membrane. Now, the tympanic membrane is connected to the malleus, which is connected to the incus, and then the incus is connected to the stapes. And the stapes is connected to a thin, transparent membrane called the oval window. And the cochlea is fluid-filled. So as this begins to vibrate, it's going to vibrate the stapes, which is connected to the oval window, and it is going to produce fluid waves within the cochlea. And depending on the frequency of the sound, high or low, that will determine the frequency of that fluid wave. Like a wave, or like you throw a rock into a pond, you see that wave, right? So this fluid wave is going to have a certain frequency. And within the cochlea, you have this guy called the organ of Corti. And there are hair cells within the organ of Corti that vary in height and thickness. And as that fluid wave comes in the cochlea, it's going to vibrate these hair cells. And when these hair cells vibrate, they open up ion channels and produce electrical impulses. And within the cochlea, you have over 30,000 individual hair cells. So that means you can hear a lot of different sounds. Damage to these hair cells, or damage to the cochlea, results in what's called sensory neural loss, meaning that even though sound waves are being transmitted, amplified by the tympanic membrane and auditory ossicles, when they are converted into this fluid within the cochlea, these hair cells are damaged and you are not going to be able to hear it. So a hearing aid is not going to help you. The only thing that's going to help you is a cochlear implant. That's why the inner ear is embedded in the temporal bone, which is the strongest bone of the body. You don't want to be damaging your inner ear, otherwise you can't hear. You don't want to. You want to hear. You want to go to here and go to gateway. All right? Now, a couple of things. Just so you know, your ears don't necessarily get bigger as you get older. Basically what happens is the skin around you, right, around your face, that kind of gets stretched. So your ears don't necessarily get bigger. One thing that does happen is you start getting hair on your ears. And sometimes it gets so bad you gotta comb it, maybe put a little Brill cream on it. You know, it's just a mess. It's nothing good about getting old. Anyways, one more thing. Watch. high frequency sound waves means that the tympanic membrane and the auditory ossicles have to vibrate very, very quickly. Well, as you get older, what happens to your bones? They become arthritic, right? Stiff. That means that these bones cannot vibrate fast enough to transmit these high frequency sounds. What's the result? Is that as you age, you lose hearing in the higher frequencies. That's why if you're a CNA, they told you that when you're dealing with the elderly to look directly at them, talk slowly, and lower the pitch of your voice. That's because lower pitch sounds, the bones don't have to vibrate as fast, and they can be transmitted and heard. High frequency sounds, as you age, these auditory ossicles just simply cannot vibrate fast enough. That's why in the elderly, they tell you to lower that pitch of the voice. So that's the eye and the ear. I hope it helped.